Sometimes the most dangerous mistake a person can make is assuming they already know who they're dealing with. The rain had been falling for nearly an hour along Highway 47, turning the asphalt into a glossy ribbon of reflected streetlights and distant headlights. Most drivers had already cleared the road, eager to reach warm homes and quiet living rooms. But one patrol cruiser remained parked along the shoulder, engine idling softly beneath the steady hum of rainfall. Inside that cruiser sat Officer Daniel Carter, a young patrol officer who had been on duty for the better part of his shift and whose patience was beginning to wear thin. Nights like this had a way of making everything feel slower, heavier, more suspicious. Every passing car seemed like it might be hiding something. Every shadow along the roadside felt like it might turn into trouble. Carter leaned forward in his seat as a black SUV rolled past at a steady 45 miles per hour, its tires slicing quietly through shallow puddles. Nothing about the vehicle appeared unusual at first glance. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't swerving. But something about it caught Carter's attention, something he couldn't quite explain even to himself. Maybe it was the tinted windows. Maybe it was the fact that the driver seemed completely calm, moving through the storm without any sign of urgency. Carter flipped on his cruiser's overhead lights. Instantly, red and blue reflections exploded across the wet pavement, bouncing off guardrails and road signs like flashes of lightning. The SUV slowed and drifted carefully toward the shoulder, coming to a smooth stop beneath a dim highway lamp. Rain tapped steadily against Carter's windshield as he stepped out of the cruiser and approached the vehicle. The driver's door opened slowly. A tall black man stepped out, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, hands relaxed at his sides, as if this interruption were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in an otherwise quiet evening. Carter studied him with a sharp, measuring look. The man didn't appear nervous. He didn't rush to explain himself. He simply stood there beneath the falling rain, waiting. That calmness irritated Carter more than he expected. "Driver's license," Carter said, his tone clipped and firm. The man nodded once and reached calmly for his wallet. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost patient. Carter watched every motion carefully, his eyes narrowing as if he were already convinced something about this stop wasn't right. The rain continued to fall around them, steady and relentless, the flashing patrol lights painting the scene in restless color. The man handed over his ID without a word. Carter barely glanced at him before turning his attention to the card. For a moment, the highway seemed strangely quiet, the kind of silence that settles in just before something changes. And neither man standing in that rain had any idea that within the next few minutes, this ordinary traffic stop was about to become the moment Officer Daniel Carter would wish he could take back. I have learned that silence on a dark road can reveal more about a person than 1,000 questions ever could. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the SUV with rain sliding down the brim of his patrol cap, the plastic of the driver license cool in his hand as the red and blue lights from his cruiser pulsed across the wet highway. The man who had handed him the identification remained exactly where he had been asked to stand, calm and patient, his posture steady despite the rain soaking into the shoulders of his jacket. Most people became nervous during a traffic stop. They shifted their weight. They asked questions. They tried to explain themselves before the officer even spoke. But this man did none of that. He simply waited, watching the patrol car lights reflect across the pavement like restless waves of color. Carter turned the card in his fingers, glancing briefly at the photograph before looking back toward the driver. Something about the man's composure felt unusual, but Carter pushed the thought aside. He had already convinced himself that this stop would reveal something worth writing up before the night ended. "Stay right there," Carter said, his voice firm as he stepped back toward the cruiser. The driver nodded once without protest. The quiet confidence in that simple nod only made Carter more certain that something about the situation felt off. He slid into the driver's seat of the patrol car and placed the license under the dim dashboard light. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield while the radio murmured softly with distant dispatch chatter. Carter began entering the information into the system, his eyes moving back and forth between the screen and the identification card. Outside, the tall man remained standing. Beside the SUV, his figure outlined by flashing emergency lights and drifting rain. A pair of passing vehicles slowed as they moved by, drivers curious about the stop unfolding along the shoulder of the highway. Carter leaned back slightly in his seat while the system processed the license. His gaze drifted toward the driver through the side mirror. The man had not moved an inch. No nervous pacing. No impatient gestures. Just calm stillness. It almost looked like the man was studying the situation rather than worrying about it. That thought made Carter frown. He picked up the radio microphone and spoke quietly to dispatch, asking for confirmation on the license information. Static filled the cruiser for a moment before the dispatcher's voice returned, steady and professional. "Stand by for confirmation," she said. Carter rested the microphone back in place and tapped his fingers lightly against the steering wheel while the seconds stretched longer than he expected. Outside, the rain grew slightly heavier, bouncing against the hood of the patrol car. The driver lifted his face toward the falling water for a moment, blinking slowly as if the storm itself did not bother him. Carter shook his head, irritation creeping into his expression. People who acted too calm always made him suspicious. Finally, the radio crackled again. The dispatcher spoke, her tone suddenly more focused than before. "Unit 12, confirm the name on that license." Carter glanced down at the card again, squinting slightly beneath the dim light as he read it aloud into the radio. A brief silence followed on the other end. Then the dispatcher spoke again, slower this time. "Unit 12, please confirm you said Marcus Bennett." Carter looked back toward the man standing in the rain beside the SUV, unaware that the next words coming through that radio were about to change the entire tone of the night. Dispatch did not answer immediately, and that silence carried a weight that Officer Daniel Carter had not expected. Rain drummed steadily against the roof of the cruiser while the red and blue lights continued to wash across the highway in restless flashes. Carter leaned closer to the radio as if the extra inch might force the response to come faster. Finally, the dispatcher spoke again, her voice careful and measured in a way that made Carter's brow tighten. "Unit 12, please confirm again the full name on that license." Carter glanced down at the card in his hand, slightly annoyed by the repeated request. "Marcus Bennett," he said clearly into the microphone. Outside the windshield, the man in question still stood beside the SUV, calm in the rain, his hands relaxed at his sides, as if he had all the time in the world. Carter looked back at the identification, studying the photograph again. The picture matched perfectly. Same steady eyes. Same composed expression. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Yet something in the dispatcher's tone lingered in Carter's mind like a warning he could not quite interpret. A soft burst of static filled the cruiser before the dispatcher returned. This time her voice sounded different. More alert. "Unit 12, stand by for supervisor confirmation." Carter leaned back in the seat and exhaled slowly through his nose. That response irritated him more than he wanted to admit. A simple license check did not normally involve supervisors. He glanced once more through the side mirror at the man waiting outside. The driver had shifted only slightly, brushing rainwater from his jacket sleeve before looking calmly toward the patrol car. There was no impatience in his posture, no visible frustration. If anything, the man seemed almost thoughtful, as if he were quietly observing how the entire situation unfolded. Carter tapped the steering wheel lightly with his fingers, watching the reflection of the flashing lights ripple across the wet pavement. Another vehicle passed slowly in the far lane, the driver glancing curiously at the scene before disappearing into the dark stretch of highway ahead. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice that answered was not the dispatcher. It was deeper, older, carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "Unit 12, this is Lieutenant Harris. Repeat the name you just ran through dispatch." Carter straightened slightly in his seat, surprised by the sudden appearance of a ranking officer on the radio. "Marcus Bennett," he repeated. A brief pause followed, the kind of pause that stretches longer than it should. Carter felt an uneasy sensation settle in his chest, though he could not explain why. Then Lieutenant Harris spoke again, slower and very deliberate. "Unit 12, where exactly are you located right now?" Carter gave the mile marker and the highway number, glancing out at the rain-soaked shoulder beside the SUV. Another pause filled the radio channel. Carter could hear faint voices in the background on the other end, as if several people had suddenly begun talking at once in the dispatch room. Then Harris returned, his tone now carrying something that sounded very close to disbelief. "Unit 12, remain where you are. Do not escalate the situation. Do you understand?" Carter frowned, gripping the microphone a little tighter. Escalate what situation? He asked, confused by the sudden urgency. The answer came slowly, every word careful. Officer Carter, the individual you stopped, is Captain Marcus Bennett. For a moment Carter simply stared through the rain at the calm figure standing beside the SUV, the flashing lights painting the scene in restless color while the meaning of those words slowly settled into place. For a long moment Officer Daniel Carter did not move. The rain continued to fall steadily across the highway while the flashing patrol lights painted the scene in restless waves of red and blue. Inside the cruiser the radio remained quiet, but the words from Lieutenant Harris echoed clearly in Carter's mind. Captain Marcus Bennett. Carter slowly looked up from the driver license still resting in his hand and stared through the windshield toward the man standing beside the black SUV. The figure in the rain had not changed at all. The tall man remained calm, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady as he waited beside the vehicle exactly where Carter had told him to stand. There was no anger in his posture, no impatience. If anything, he appeared almost thoughtful, as if he had been quietly watching the entire situation unfold step by step. Carter felt a strange tightness settle in his chest. He looked back down at the identification card again, this time reading every line carefully beneath the dim dashboard light. The name was clear. Marcus Bennett. Beneath it was a title that Carter somehow had not noticed the first time he glanced at the card. Police Captain. District Command. Carter swallowed and shifted in his seat. Outside the windshield the rain continued to tap against the glass in a steady rhythm, while passing headlights occasionally stretched across the wet pavement before disappearing into the dark highway ahead. Carter picked up the radio microphone again, his voice slightly less certain than before. Lieutenant Harris, confirm that information, he said. The response came quickly this time. Confirmed, Officer Carter. Captain Bennett oversees the entire district. Carter lowered the microphone slowly. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he felt a flicker of uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. He replayed the last few minutes in his mind. The quick decision to pull the vehicle over. The sharp tone when he asked for the license. The suspicion he had carried from the moment the SUV passed his cruiser. Outside, Captain Bennett remained beside the vehicle, rainwater sliding from the edge of his jacket, while the emergency lights reflected across the wet ground around his feet. Carter suddenly noticed something he had overlooked earlier. The captain had never argued, never raised his voice. He had simply followed instructions and waited. That calm patience now seemed far more deliberate than Carter first assumed. Carter opened the cruiser door and stepped back out into the rain. The cold air brushed across his face as he walked toward the SUV once more. Captain Bennett turned slightly as Carter approached, meeting the young officer's gaze with the same composed expression he had worn from the beginning. For a moment neither man spoke. The steady rhythm of rain and distant traffic filled the silence between them. Carter held the license out again, the flashing lights reflecting faintly across the plastic surface. Captain Bennett accepted it calmly and placed it back into his wallet without rushing. Then he looked directly at Carter with a quiet expression that revealed nothing but steady awareness. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked in a calm voice that carried easily through the sound of the rain. Carter hesitated for the briefest second, realizing that the ordinary traffic stop he believed he was controlling had just become something entirely different. Officer Daniel Carter felt the rain soaking slowly through the shoulders of his uniform as the silence between them stretched longer than expected. The flashing patrol lights continued to sweep across the highway, casting moving bands of red and blue across the wet pavement and the side of the black SUV. Captain Marcus Bennett stood calmly a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his expression steady, as if he had already seen situations like this unfold many times before. Carter cleared his throat quietly, suddenly aware that the authority he had felt only minutes earlier now seemed uncertain. The captain's simple question still hung in the air. "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter shifted his weight slightly and glanced back toward the cruiser as if searching for the confidence he had left inside the vehicle. "I stopped you because your vehicle caught my attention," Carter finally said, trying to keep his voice firm. The explanation sounded thinner than he expected once it left his mouth. Captain Bennett nodded slowly, not interrupting. Rain continued to slide from the edge of his jacket while distant headlights moved along the highway behind them like slow drifting stars. "I understand," Bennett said calmly. His voice carried no anger, No accusation, only quiet patience. That calm tone unsettled Carter more than a complaint would have. The young officer suddenly realized that the captain had given him every opportunity to handle the situation professionally from the beginning. Carter glanced again at the SUV, noticing details he had ignored earlier. The vehicle was clean, well-maintained, with a small department parking sticker placed carefully on the lower corner of the windshield. The kind issued only to command staff who frequently moved between district facilities. Carter felt a small knot tighten in his stomach as the pieces began falling into place. For the first time that night, he began to see the stop from a different angle. Captain Bennett watched the young officer carefully, but said nothing more. The captain's silence felt deliberate, almost instructional, as if he were allowing Carter the space to recognize the moment on his own. Rain tapped against the hood of the SUV in a steady rhythm, while the highway remained mostly empty. Finally Bennett spoke again, his tone still calm, but slightly more direct. "Officer Carter, may I ask why you believe my vehicle required a stop tonight?" The question was simple, but Carter could hear the weight behind it. It was the kind of question supervisors asked during training reviews. A question meant to reveal the reasoning behind a decision. Carter opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated. The truth suddenly felt harder to explain than he expected. When he first pulled onto the highway shoulder, he had been certain of himself. Now that certainty had begun to fade under the steady gaze of the man standing before him. Carter looked briefly toward the flashing lights reflecting across the road, and then back to the captain. "I thought something about the vehicle seemed suspicious," he said carefully. Captain Bennett studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with a quiet focus that felt far more serious than raised voices ever could be. The rain continued falling between them as the patrol lights flickered across both men. Then the captain gave a slow, thoughtful nod, as if he had just confirmed something important. And in that moment Officer Carter began to realize that this stop was no longer just a routine moment on a quiet highway. It had quietly become a lesson that the young officer would not soon forget. The rain continued to fall steadily along the quiet stretch of highway, while the flashing patrol lights painted restless colors across the wet asphalt. Officer Daniel Carter stood facing Captain Marcus Bennett, feeling the weight of the conversation settle deeper with every passing second. The captain's calm presence made the moment feel strangely different from any other stop Carter had handled before. There was no anger in Bennett's expression, no raised voice, only the steady attention of someone who had spent many years observing people under pressure. Carter shifted slightly, the damp fabric of his uniform heavy against his shoulders as the silence stretched again. Passing headlights briefly illuminated the scene before fading into the distance, leaving only the glow of the cruiser lights and the sound of rain tapping against metal. Captain Bennett folded his hands calmly in front of him and looked toward the highway for a moment before returning his gaze to Carter. "You said the vehicle seemed suspicious," Bennett said quietly. "Tell me what exactly made you think that?" The question was not spoken like an accusation. It sounded more like something a senior officer might ask during a training exercise, the kind designed to understand the reasoning behind a decision. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but the words came slower now. Earlier in the night his judgment had felt immediate and certain. Now it felt more complicated. He glanced briefly toward the SUV again, noticing how ordinary the vehicle looked beneath the rain and flashing lights. "It was late," Carter said carefully. "The road was mostly empty. I noticed the vehicle passing and thought it was worth checking." Captain Bennett listened without interrupting. The captain's eyes remained steady, thoughtful, as if measuring not just the explanation but the way it was being delivered. Another car passed slowly in the far lane, the driver turning his head toward the scene before continuing down the highway. Bennett nodded once, acknowledging the answer. "Officer Carter," he said after a moment, "a traffic stop carries responsibility. Every decision made during that moment matters." The words were calm, but carried quiet authority. Carter felt them settle heavily in the air between them. Bennett glanced briefly toward the patrol cruiser, where the camera mounted near the windshield continued recording the interaction exactly as it had from the beginning. "Every stop becomes part of the record," Bennett continued. "That record tells a story about how we treat the public and how we represent the badge we wear." Carter followed the captain's gaze toward the cruiser camera and suddenly became aware of how much of the encounter had been captured without interruption. The flashing lights reflected across the lens as rain continued to fall. Carter felt a quiet realization forming in his mind. This moment was not simply about a mistaken stop or a misunderstanding on a quiet road. It was about judgment, professionalism, and the expectations placed on anyone who carried authority. Captain Bennett turned his attention back to the young officer and spoke again, his voice still calm but unmistakably firm. "I am not upset about being stopped," Bennett said. "Officers must make decisions every day. But those decisions must always come from observation and clear reasoning, not assumption." The rain continued falling between them while the highway remained mostly silent. Carter lowered his eyes briefly, absorbing the words. For the first time since the stop began, he understood that the lesson unfolding on this dark road had very little to do with traffic laws and everything to do with the responsibility that came with the uniform he wore. The rain had not slowed, and the highway lights reflected across the wet road like a long ribbon of glass stretching into the darkness. Officer Daniel Carter stood quietly as Captain Marcus Bennett's words settled in the air between them. The steady rhythm of falling rain seemed louder now, filling the silence that followed the captain's calm explanation about responsibility and judgment. Carter felt the meaning of those words more clearly with every passing second. Earlier in the night, he had approached the stop with confidence, certain that he was simply doing his job. Now that certainty had been replaced with something far more complicated. Captain Bennett watched him carefully, not with anger but with the measured patience of someone who had spent many years guiding younger officers through difficult lessons. The captain shifted his stance slightly and looked toward the patrol cruiser again, where the dashboard camera continued recording every moment beneath the flashing lights. "When people see those lights behind them on a dark road," Bennett said quietly, "they are trusting that the person stepping out of that cruiser will treat them fairly." Carter followed the captain's gaze toward the cruiser, noticing how the red and blue reflections moved across the wet pavement like waves. The small camera mounted near the windshield blinked softly as it continued capturing the encounter. Carter had worn the uniform long enough to know that those recordings were more than just routine documentation. They told the full story of how an officer chose to handle each situation. Bennett turned his attention back to Carter, his voice steady but firm. "Authority can make a person feel powerful," he continued. "But the truth is that the badge is meant to remind us of restraint, not control." Carter listened carefully, the rain running down the sides of his patrol cap, while distant headlights occasionally passed along the highway behind them. The captain's words were not delivered like a lecture. They sounded more like quiet guidance, the kind offered by someone who understood the importance of experience shaping judgment. Carter felt a growing awareness that the moment unfolding on this empty road would stay with him long after the shift ended. Captain Bennett placed his hands calmly at his sides and studied the young officer for another moment before speaking again. "Tell me something honestly, Officer Carter," he said. "If you watched this stop later through that camera recording, would you feel confident explaining every decision you made tonight?" The question was simple, but Carter felt the weight behind it immediately. He pictured the entire encounter replaying on a screen. The flashing lights, the questions, the assumptions that had guided his actions from the beginning. For the first time since the stop began, Carter understood exactly what the captain was asking him to consider. Not just what had happened, but why it had happened. Carter lowered his gaze briefly toward the wet pavement as the rain continued falling around them. When he finally looked back up, Captain Bennett was still watching him calmly, waiting for the answer. And in that quiet moment on the dark highway, Carter realized that this encounter had quietly transformed into something far more important than a routine traffic stop. It had become a test of character, one that no officer could ignore once the truth behind it became clear. Officer Daniel Carter felt the captain's question linger in the cold air long after it was spoken. The rain continued to fall steadily across the quiet highway, each drop tapping softly against the hood of the patrol cruiser, while the red and blue lights flashed in slow waves across the wet pavement. Carter looked toward the dashboard camera again, suddenly aware of how clearly the small device had been observing everything from the moment he activated his lights. Every word, every decision, every assumption. The realization made the silence between the two men feel heavier than before. Captain Marcus Bennett stood calmly beside the black SUV, his posture steady despite the rain soaking through his jacket. He did not rush Carter for an answer. Instead, he waited, the way an experienced mentor might wait for a younger officer to recognize an important truth on his own. Carter inhaled slowly, the cool air filling his lungs as he searched for the honesty the captain had asked for. "No, sir," Carter said quietly after a moment. The words came out slower than he expected, but once spoken they felt undeniable. Bennett nodded slightly, acknowledging the response without any sign of satisfaction or disappointment. The captain's calm expression suggested that the answer itself mattered less than the understanding behind it. A distant truck passed along the highway, its headlights sweeping across the scene before disappearing into the darkness ahead. The road returned to its quiet rhythm of rain and flashing patrol lights. Bennett looked toward the cruiser again, then back to Carter. "Recognizing a mistake is where professionalism begins," the captain said in a steady voice. "Every officer will face moments that test judgment. What defines the officer is how they respond once they realize it." Carter lowered his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the captain's words settle into his thoughts. Only minutes earlier he had been certain that this stop was routine. Now it felt like the most important moment of his entire shift. Bennett stepped slightly closer to the SUV, brushing rainwater from the edge of the door handle before turning back toward Carter. "When you wear that badge," Bennett continued calmly, "people trust that you will. See them clearly, not through assumptions." The patrol lights continued reflecting across both men, illuminating the rain that fell steadily between them. Carter felt a quiet determination building beneath the embarrassment he had first felt. He knew that moments like this could either shape a person into a better officer or allow the same mistakes to repeat again and again. Bennett studied the young officer carefully before speaking one final time. "Tonight you have an opportunity most officers do not receive," he said. "You have the chance to see the lesson immediately instead of years later." Carter met the captain's gaze again, understanding the meaning behind those words. This moment was not simply about being corrected by a superior officer. It was about recognizing the responsibility that came with authority before that responsibility could be misused again. The rain continued to fall along the empty highway, while the flashing lights painted restless colors across the road. And standing there beneath those lights, Officer Daniel Carter realized that the lesson unfolding on that quiet stretch of pavement would remain with him long after the storm finally passed. The rain had begun to soften, turning from a steady downpour into a gentle mist that drifted through the glow of the patrol lights. The quiet highway stretched endlessly in both directions, reflecting faint streaks of red and blue across the wet pavement. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the cruiser, feeling the cool night air settle around him as Captain Marcus Bennett's words continued to echo in his mind. For several seconds neither man spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt reflective, as if the moment itself was allowing the lesson to sink deeper than any lecture ever could. Carter looked once more toward the small camera mounted inside the cruiser. That lens had quietly captured everything from the moment the emergency lights had turned on. Every decision, every tone of voice, every assumption that had shaped the encounter. For the first time in his career, Carter truly understood how much responsibility rested behind something as simple as activating those lights. Captain Bennett stepped toward the driver door of the SUV and rested his hand lightly on the handle before turning back toward the young officer. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness behind his gaze that made his final words carry weight. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice steady in the soft rain. "No one expects perfection from an officer. What the public deserves is awareness and fairness." Carter listened carefully, standing straighter now than he had earlier in the stop. The embarrassment he had first felt had slowly transformed into something more useful. A clear understanding of how easily authority could be guided by the wrong instinct if it was not balanced by careful thought. Bennett gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that the lesson had reached its mark. "The badge does not exist to prove who has control," he continued. "It exists to remind us who we are responsible for." The words hung in the air between them while the distant sound of tires moved faintly along the highway. Carter felt a quiet determination settle inside him. Moments earlier he had believed the stop would end with paperwork and routine procedure. Instead it had revealed something far more important about the role he carried every day. Carter spoke carefully, his voice steady despite the rain. "I understand, Captain," he said. Thank you for giving me the chance to see it clearly. Bennett studied him for a moment, then offered a small approving nod before opening the door of the SUV. The interior light flickered softly as he stepped inside the vehicle. For a moment he paused and looked back toward the cruiser and the young officer standing beside it. The flashing lights reflected across the road one last time before Carter finally reached through the open driver window of the patrol car and switched them off. Instantly the highway returned to its natural darkness, lit only by distant street lamps and the fading glow of the storm clouds above. Captain Bennett's SUV pulled smoothly back onto the road and disappeared into the quiet distance. Carter remained beside the cruiser for a moment longer, watching the empty highway stretch ahead. The rain continued falling lightly around him, but the lesson from that night felt clearer than the storm itself. And as he finally returned to the driver's seat of the